This video contains Game of Thrones spoilers up to Season 8, Episode 5. You've been warned. Okay, so guess what? Our queen is dead. Ish. Probably. Squished in a tomb with the man she was once squished in a womb with, and it's probably for the best. But maybe not. Jesus, what a buzzkill. But Queen Cersei lives on. Not in the future, not in our hearts, but in the past. This is making any sense yet? One thing you can count on in Game of Thrones is that pretty much every character and major event in this behemoth in some way parallels something historical. I mean, you're not going to be surprised to hear that George R.R. Martin is a giant history nerd. Like, for example, our Queen Cersei. She generates so much hate, it can't possibly be contained in just one historical figure. Her character, her personality, her experiences, the way she relates to her environment, it forms a patchwork quilt of different historical hate magnets across time and space. Cersei Lannister, is not a secret, likes her twin brother Jaime a bit too much. To the Targaryens, marrying your sister is just part of the family business, but in the rest of Westeros, it's a bit of a no-no. Also, to me, also a no-no. As much as I like to think that Cersei's relationship with Jaime was entirely indigenous to Martin's depraved imagination, there was a similar couple from around the time that Jesus was first being Jesus. You may not know who Julia Drusilla is, but chances are you've heard of her brother, Caligula. He is no Jaime, but his relationship with his sister was potentially similar. Now, the popular theory that Caligula was committing incest with his sisters is based on unproven rumors that were circulated by his political enemies, and we thought today's politicians were savage. Here's what we know for certain. Caligula and Julia were very close. He publicly favored her over his other sisters. He even named her as his heir when he fell ill in 37 CE, which was unprecedented, and when she died of an illness, he took that very hard, burying her with the honors of a Roman empress and having her officially declared a goddess. Whether or not they were really lovers, we will never know for sure, but it's certainly good enough for some high-quality inspiration for a fantasy author. So that's Cersei's relationship with her brother in history. What about her relationship with her children? Well, if you're familiar with the work of Philippa Gregory, you definitely know who Elizabeth Woodville is. She was the wife of King Edward IV of York, the victor of the War of the Roses. There's a lot of War of the Roses talk when it comes to Game of Thrones. When Edward died suddenly after a short illness, it was specified that his younger brother Richard was to rule England as regent until the king's heir, who was also named Edward, came of age. At the time of Edward IV's death, Edward V was a 12-year-old kid, which was a little young, even by medieval standards. By law, Richard was supposed to become Lord Protector of the Realm, but Elizabeth Woodville had other ideas. The Dowager Queen, that's what you call it when the queen is there but the king has died, started placing members of her immediate family in stations of authority and rushing to get her son crowned immediately despite his young age, completely circumventing Richard's authority, not unlike Cersei when she tore up Robert's will in front of Ned's face. Now, it didn't quite work out for Elizabeth, though, as unlike Ned Stark, Richard was able to intercept the young king to be on his way to his coronation and install himself as Lord Protector of the Realm, as the will had specified. Whew! If that's not enough of a parallel, let's talk about Livia Drusilla, the great-grandmother, by marriage, of the aforementioned Julia Drusilla. Livia was the OG Roman empress. Her husband, Emperor Augustus, was the first Roman emperor. He started that whole trend. As a Roman lady, Livia was unusual in her power, but the two had no children together in their 51 years of marriage. Livia did, however, have two sons from a different father, Joffrey and Tiberius and Drusus. According to popular legend, Livia was dead set on making Tiberius her husband's successor. If that's true, she must have had cast iron patience, because Tiberius's trajectory to the seat of his stepfather is super convoluted and swamped with the dead bodies of all of Augustus's intended successors, almost none of whom were murdered. We don't have time to get into the details, but basically the death count is massive. There was also a great deal of hearsay at the time floating around that Livia was responsible for some or all of those deaths. The most elaborate of these speculative assassinations was that of her husband himself. As the legend goes, she had poisoned the figs in Augustus's garden while they were still on the vine, as he had become so paranoid in his old age that he refused to eat anything he hadn't grown and picked himself. These rumors remain unproven, and many have been dismissed by modern historians as fabrications concocted by political enemies of Livia and her son Tiberius. But the complicated and somewhat suspicious circumstances of Tiberius' rise to power still lend themselves to the characterization of his mother as a manipulative Machiavellian mastermind, a characterization that lives on in the popular work of historical fiction I, Claudius, and of course, in Cersei Lannister. Did I mention that George R. R. Martin is a Robert Graves fan? Because he definitely is. So you may have guessed this one already, but the Walk of Atonement is definitely based on real stuff that happened. In the Middle Ages, women found guilty of adultery were sometimes expelled from their homes, parted with their dowries, or had their heads shaved and forced to parade through the streets. Though they were never nude, they were often forced to walk around in underclothes, which at the time of long dresses and veils would be roughly as lurid and shocking as nudity would be to us. Now, I haven't heard this one very much, but let's imagine that Cersei is, get this, a good queen. For that, we gotta go way back, like 1,500 years before the birth of Jesus back, in Egypt. Hatshepsut was married to her half-brother, Pharaoh Thutmose II, so that's familiar. But instead of having babies with another guy, that is what her husband did, except not with a guy, with a woman. And then after her husband's son was born from another woman, he then promptly died, leaving behind a 2-year-old heir who was her, stepson and also half-nephew. Yup. Instead of murdering that baby so that her biological daughter could be queen, like Cersei definitely would have, she just did the part where she immediately declared herself pharaoh, and then once he grew up, actually ruled jointly with her stepson half-nephew, Thutmose III, for 20 years until her death. She is considered by modern Egyptologists to be one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, building hundreds of temples and monuments through Upper and Lower Egypt, re-establishing trade routes, and ruling longer than any other woman from an indigenous Egyptian dynasty. Now, we focused a lot on ladies today, which is bound to happen in a world where being a woman and a ruler is unusual enough that that ends up being their defining characteristic. It's just the world we're in. But for our final act, let's go dude. Richard III was the third and final English monarch from the House of York. He came to power when he convinced all the right people that his brother's son was the product of bigamy and so wasn't legit, and so he inherited the throne instead of that kid. That didn't go over well with a lot of folks, and so a bunch of people tried to murder him. He managed to quell that rebellion, but every step he went down the path to keeping the throne, he lost more and more support. Sound familiar? Well, that's when, from across a sea, came the direct descendant of a previous royal house, who had a very big battle with him, in which Richard died. You may have heard from Shakespeare that he very badly wanted a horse. In short, the story of Richard III's end is the story of Cersei's. She cut off the Baratheon line, seized power, and alienated absolutely everyone along the way. In the end, she's left saying, a scorpion, my kingdom for a scorpion. At least Arya got a horse. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, this video seems like it's about to end, and he hasn't talked about Margaret of Anjou. How is that possible? What a terrible oversight. And I also want to slurp deeply of the delicious nutty milkshake that is the entirety of the War of the Roses, but we can't. And others have already told that particular story fairly well, so I'm just gonna skip her. It's too convoluted and weird and awesome. Maybe it needs its own video, but it is not for today. This video's script was written by Rachel Miller, who I met on Twitter, and edited by me. Thank you, Rachel. This was fun. I'm sorry I cut out so much of the stuff you wrote about Rasputin.